Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Late 13th century Java, the year is 1292. A highly influential king is murdered during a palace ritual,
Right.
and his heir is forced to flee for his life into the dense tropical forests of eastern Java.
While the kingdom just completely descends into utter political chaos.
Exactly. And at the same time, a fleet of over 1,000 Mongol warships appears on the northern horizon, carrying roughly 20 to 30,000 seasoned troops, and they are demanding absolute submission.
It is a radical situation.
It really is. And the seemingly impossible crisis is not the end of a civilization. It is actually the violent, remarkably complicated origin story of the Majapahit Empire. So today, you are going on a deep dive into Majapahit. It's a Javanese Hindu-Buddhist thalassocracy.
Which simply means a maritime empire, right? An empire of the sea.
Yeah, an empire of the sea. And Majapahit dominated Southeast Asia from 1293 to roughly 1527. This deep dive is part of our Southeast Asian history series. To guide you through this, we are drawing from a wealth of historical sources.
We are. We're examining archaeological digs at the capital city of Trollan, analyzing old Javanese texts like the Nagareka Dagama and the Periton.
And we are also cross-referencing those with Chinese imperial records from the Yuan and Ming dynasties. Okay, let's unpack this. We have an assassinated king, an heir in hiding, and an incoming Mongol invasion force. How do these three separate catastrophes intersect?
Well, to understand the mechanics of this crisis, we really have to establish the geopolitical reality of the year 1292. The dominant power at Eastern Java at this moment is the Singasari kingdom, led by King Kartanagra.
Right.
He was a very expansionist ruler. He had already launched military campaigns into Sumatra. His goal was to secure control over the vital trade routes of the archipelago.
But his ambitions put him on a direct collision course with a much larger power expanding from the north, which was the Yuan dynasty in China, commanded by Kublai Khan.
Yes, and Kublai Khan is busy consolidating the largest contiguous land empire in history. He isn't exactly known for asking nicely when he wants something.
No, he isn't.
He basically operated on the concept of suzerainty, which is a system where a dominant empire dictates the foreign policy and trade relations of a smaller state. But they allow that state to manage its own internal affairs.
So Kublai Khan sent diplomatic envoys to Java demanding tribute, right? And formal submission to the Yuan dynasty?
Yeah, he did. But King Kartanagra not only refused this demand, he deliberately mutilated one of the Mongol envoys.
Wait, mutilated?
Historical sources indicate he branded the envoy's face and cut off his nose. And then he just sent the delegation back to China.
That is a massive provocation. I mean, if you are a regional king in Java, you have to know that mutilating a Mongol envoy guarantees a military retaliation.
Oh, absolutely. It was a calculated, albeit fatal, risk. Kartanagra likely assumed that the sheer geographical distance and the treacherous monsoon winds of the South China Sea would protect Java from a full-scale Mongol invasion.
But he was mistaken.
He was very mistaken. Kublai Khan authorized a massive punitive expedition. A fleet of hundreds of ocean-going junks set sail from the port city of Quanzhou. This was under the command of veteran generals like Ike Mays and Gao Xing.
And they were carrying, what, between 20 and 30,000 troops?
Yeah, a mix of Mongol cavalry and Han Chinese infantry.
So let's look at the timing here, because this is where the historical narrative becomes chaotic. The Mongol fleet is navigating the South China Sea, expecting to punish King Kartanagra. But back in Java, Kartanagra isn't even around to face the consequences.
Right, because while the Mongol fleet is en route, the internal structure of the Singasari kingdom fractures. A local regent named Jaya Katwang launches a sudden, well-coordinated rebellion.
He ruled the vassal state of Kadiri.
He did. He attacks the capital, assassinates King Kartanagra, and effectively usurps control of eastern Java.
So the Mongol armada arrives on the shores of Java to execute a king who is already dead, and to subjugate a kingdom that has just overthrown its own government.
Exactly. And caught directly in the crossfire of this geopolitical mess is Kartanagra's son-in-law, Prince Raden Wijaya.
He narrowly escapes the assassination of his father-in-law, flees to the neighboring island of Madura, and has to plan his next move. I mean, if we look at this practically, Raden Wijaya is a prince without an army and without a state.
He is. He is hiding in the forest while tens of thousands of Mongol troops land on the coast. Most rulers would try to run as far away as possible in that situation.
But Raden Wijaya takes the opposite approach. He utilizes a very extreme form of political pragmatism.
He does. He recognizes that he lacks the military strength to defeat the usurper Jaya Katwang on his own. So when the Mongol forces land on the northern coast of Java in early 1293, Raden Wijaya actually approaches the Mongol commanders.
He presents himself not as an enemy, but as the rightful loyal heir to the kingdom who is willing to submit to Kublai Khan.
He essentially offers to give the Mongols exactly what they came for, on the condition that they do his fighting for him. He promises that if they help him crush Jai Khantuang, he will provide the tribute and acknowledge Yuang's suzerainty.
And for the Mongol commanders, this alliance makes perfect logistical sense, doesn't it?
It really does. They are operating in a completely alien, dense, tropical environment. They desperately need local intelligence, navigators, and a clear path to the new power center in Kadiri.
It just seems like a huge gamble for Wijaya, inviting the most lethal military machine of the 13th century to settle a domestic dispute. But militarily, the plan executes perfectly.
It does. In April 1293, the combined forces of the Mongols and Raden Wijaya march on Kadiri. The Mongol military doctrine just overwhelms Jaya Khantuang's defenses.
Utilizing siege engineers and disciplined infantry tactics.
Exactly. They inflict heavy casualties and secure the capital. The usurper is defeated. But this victory immediately triggers Raden Wijaya's second, much more dangerous maneuver.
This is the moment where Wijaya flips the script. The Mongols have just won the war for him, but now they are an occupying force in his territory. How does a local prince force an army of 20,000 seasoned veterans to just pack up and leave?
Well, he leverages the environment and human exhaustion. The Mongol troops, while victorious, are overextended. These are soldiers accustomed to the steppes and temperate climates of China.
Now operating in the humid, disease-prone environment of equatorial Java.
Right. So Raden Wijaya requests permission from the Mongol commanders to return to his newly established settlement in the Tarik timberland, ostensibly to gather the massive tribute he promised them.
And the Mongol commanders, presumably feeling confident after their victory, just allow him to leave with his own contingent of troops.
Yeah, they let him go.
Oh.
But once Wijaya is away from the main Mongol encampment, he immediately mobilizes his loyalist forces. In May 1293, he launches a series of coordinated guerrilla ambushes against the Mongol garrisons.
And the historical chronicles highlight a very specific botanical detail regarding this ambush, don't they?
They do. While waiting for the tribute, the Mongol troops were resting and feasting in the Javanese heat. They consumed a local fruit called the Maja fruit.
Which is highly bitter and mildly intoxicating, or at least impairing to their physical discipline. I want to focus on that fruit because it becomes central to the entire identity of the region. They are eating a fruit that makes them sluggish and disorganized, right as Wijaya strikes.
Exactly. Wijaya's forces strike with deep knowledge of the local terrain. They cut off supply lines, harass the Mongol columns in the dense jungle, and use the oppressive heat to their advantage.
The Mongol commanders quickly realize that a prolonged counterinsurgency campaign in the Javanese interior is totally unsustainable.
Right. They are forced into a chaotic fighting retreat back to their ships on the coast, and they eventually abandon the island entirely and sail back to China.
Which brings us directly to the nomenclature of the empire, the name Majapahit.
The old Javanese word maja refers to the eagle marmelos, commonly known as the bale fruit, and the word pahit simply means bitter.
So bitter fruit.
Yes. The foundational legends state that when Raden Wijaya and his followers were originally clearing the Tarik timberland to build their settlement, they encountered a resilient maja tree. The fruit was intensely bitter, yet the tree itself was hardy and tenacious.
So Raden Wijaya adopted it as the symbol for his new kingdom, a realm born from bitter struggle but possessing deep roots and resilience. They also used a formal name, Wilwatikta. I've seen that term used in some of the texts.
Wilwatikta is a Sanskrit calque of the words maja and pahit.
A calque is a linguistic term for a word-for-word translation from one language into another, right?
Exactly. In this era, Sanskrit was the prestigious liturgical language of the royal courts across South and Southeast Asia. By translating bitter fruit into the Sanskrit Wilwatikta, Wijaya was elevating the status of his new capital,
signaling that it was a sophisticated, divinely sanctioned center of power, not just a rebel camp in the woods.
Precisely. So in November 1293, Raden Wijaya is officially crowned. He takes the regnal name Kurtarajasa Jayawardhana.
He has manipulated a global superpower, eliminated his domestic rival, and established a new capital at Trallin. But he still has a legitimacy problem. He was only the son-in-law of the previous king. How does he cement his right to rule this newly unified territory?
He secures his dynastic legitimacy through strategic marriages. He marries the 4 daughters of the late King Kertanegara.
So by doing this, he physically and legally links his new Majapahit state directly to the royal bloodline of the fallen Singasari kingdom.
Right. It is a clear message to the regional lords that his rule is a continuation of the legitimate order, not an interruption.
However, establishing an empire through military cunning and strategic marriages is very different from actually governing it day to day. We often see this pattern in history. A highly effective military founder unites a territory, but the second generation struggles to hold it together. And that is exactly what happens when Raden Wijaya dies in 1309.
It is. The transition of power to his son Jayanagara is completely disastrous. Jayanagara ruled from 1309 to 1328, and the historical texts refer to him by the moniker Kala Jamet.
Which translates to weak villain. That is definitely not the title you want recorded in the official chronicles.
No, it isn't. It reflects a reign defined by perpetual instability. The coalition of regional lords that Raden Wijaya had carefully balanced began to fracture under Jayanagara.
He faced a series of severe internal rebellions, right?
He did. The chronicles paint him as deeply immoral and unpopular. They even note his attempts to marry his own stepsisters to consolidate power, a move that severely alienated the court elites.
His reign ultimately ends not on the battlefield, but in his own chambers.
In 1328, Jayanagara is murdered by his personal physician, a man named Tancha, supposedly during a minor surgical procedure. And the assassination plunges the Majapahit court into a profound succession crisis. There was no clear male heir, the regional lords are restless, and the entire political apparatus is on the verge of collapsing back into civil war.
This is a critical juncture, and it is at this exact moment of extreme vulnerability that the survival of the Majapahit Empire falls entirely into the hands of its women.
Yes. In the absence of a male heir, legal and spiritual authority reverted to the most revered matriarch of the royal family, Gayatri Rajapatni.
She was one of the original 4 daughters of King Kirtinagar, right? And the widow of Raden Wijaya.
Exactly. She possessed the most unassailable legitimate claim to the throne.
But she doesn't actually crown herself, does she?
She does not. Prior to the crisis, Gayatri Rajapatni had formally retired from worldly political affairs to become a bhikshuni, which is a fully ordained female Buddhist monastic.
Oh, I see.
Because her monastic vows precluded her from directly ruling the state, she exercised her authority by appointing her daughter, Tribhuwana Wijaya Tungdadewi, to rule under her auspices as queen regnant.
If we look at 14th century societies globally, seeing a queen regnant, a woman ruling in her own right, holding ultimate executive power rather than just acting as a temporary regent for a toddler, is notable. What does Tribhuwana's ascension reveal about the fundamental social structures of Javanese society at this time?
It reveals a societal framework based on bilateral kinship. Unlike rigid patriarchal systems where lineage and inheritance are traced exclusively through the male line, Javanese society traced descent and past property through both the maternal and paternal lines.
So elite women in Majapahit could own extensive agricultural estates. They could control vast economic resources and wield significant political influence.
Exactly. Tribhuwana was not a ceremonial figurehead placed on the throne to keep the seat warm.
She actually had to govern a fracturing empire.
And she governed effectively.
Yeah.
Her reign, from 1328 to 1350, really stabilized the political core. She suppressed the lingering rebellions that had plagued her predecessor.
And more importantly, she possessed the executive acumen to identify brilliant administrative talent. In 1336, she made the most consequential personnel decision in the history of the empire. She appointed a man named Gajah Mada to the role of Mahapati, or prime minister.
Yes, Gajah Mada is a monumental figure in Southeast Asian history.
He doesn't come from the high nobility, does he?
He doesn't. He rises through the military ranks. He began his career in the Royal Guard and distinguished himself by protecting the royal family during the rebellions of Jayanagara's reign. By the time Queen Tribhuwana appoints him as Mahapati, he is a seasoned tactician with a deep understanding of statecraft.
When he takes office, he makes a public declaration that completely alters the trajectory of the empire.
He delivers an oath recorded in the Paraton Chronicle, known as the Sumpa Palapa, or the Palapa Oath.
Right.
Standing before the royal court, Gajah Mada swears that he will completely abstain from consuming palapa until the entire Nusantara is unified under the suzerainties of Majapahit.
Let's break down those two terms because they are vital. What exactly is palapa and what is the Nusantara?
Well, palapa generally refers to the spices used to flavor food. But in a broader philosophical context, it signifies worldly pleasures and comfortable indulgence. He is basically taking a vow of ascetic discipline.
And the term Nusantara?
It translates to the outer islands, or the archipelago. He is explicitly promising to conquer and unify the vast network of islands stretching across Southeast Asia.
If I am an administrator in the Majapahit court in 1336, and the new prime minister announces he is going to conquer thousands of kilometers of open ocean and dense island jungles, I would ask one simple question: how?
It's a fair question.
Today, enforcing political will across an archipelago relies on satellite communication, motorized navies, and air superiority. How did Gajah Mada intend to physically project state power across the sea in the 14th century?
He executed a massive reorganization of the military and logistical infrastructure. Majapahit could not rely on ad hoc peasant levies who needed to return to their farms for the harvest.
Right, they needed a professional force.
Exactly. Chinese merchants observing the empire during this period, such as Wang Daiguan, who authored the Dois Lui, noted that Majapahit maintained a highly professional standing army of approximately 30,000 troops.
30,000 full-time professional soldiers in the 14th century is an immense force. But having them is one thing. Feeding and paying them is entirely different. How does the central state manage that without bankrupting itself?
They managed it through a sophisticated monetary system. These soldiers were paid directly in gold by the central treasury.
Which is a crucial mechanic of imperial control.
It really is. When a soldier's livelihood comes directly from the capital, rather than from the local landholdings of a regional lord, their primary loyalty remains with the king and the Mahapati. It centralizes military power.
Let's look at the composition of this military. It isn't just 30,000 infantrymen standing in a line.
At the core of the land forces were the Bhyankara. This was an elite guard unit. It was originally tasked with protecting the monarch, but it evolved into a highly trained shock troop division leading vanguard assaults.
But to conquer an archipelago, land forces are useless without naval superiority.
Right. Majapahit projected power through massive fleets of warships known as jong.
Let's dive into the engineering of these jong ships, because they are fundamentally different from European vessels of the same era.
They were massive, multi-masted wooden vessels capable of carrying hundreds of moraines and tons of supplies. And the construction technique was entirely indigenous to the region.
Unlike European ships that relied on iron nails to hold the hull together.
Yes. Javanese shipwrights built the jong using multiple layers of thick teak wood fastened together with wooden dowels.
Why use wooden dowels instead of iron nails? Is it just a lack of metallurgy?
Not at all. It is a highly deliberate engineering choice adapted to the environment. Iron nails rust rapidly in the salty, humid environment of the tropical oceans.
Oh, that makes sense.
Furthermore, a rigid iron-nailed hull can shatter upon impact with coral reefs. A hull fastened with wooden dowels has flexibility. It can bend and absorb the shock of rough monsoon seas or minor reef strikes without fracturing.
That is highly effective structural engineering. And how are they navigating these massive vessels?
Instead of a single central rudder at the stern, the jong utilized two massive steering oars mounted on the sides of the ship.
And they had distinct sails too, didn't they?
They did. They featured multiple masts with distinct canted rectangular sails, allowing them to effectively capture the complex shifting winds of the monsoon seasons.
So they have the ships to transport the army. What about weaponry? You mentioned earlier that they were facing advanced Mongol artillery. Did Majapahit adopt any of that technology?
They heavily integrated early firearms into their naval doctrine. Majapahit forces utilized the setbang cannon.
Are these large, heavy iron cannons like you would see on a European galleon?
No, setbang were predominantly breech-loading swivel guns cast from bronze or brass.
A breech-loading design means the gunpowder and projectile are loaded from the rear of the weapon, right? Rather than being rammed down the muzzle.
Exactly. This allowed for a significantly faster rate of fire. They were mounted on the rails of the jong warships. During naval engagements or coastal amphibious assaults, these weapons provided devastating anti-personnel firepower.
Clearing the decks of enemy ships before the Majapahit Marines initiated boarding actions. So with this professionalized army, the massive jong fleets, and advanced artillery, Gajah Mada begins executing his vow. Where does he strike first?
He targets the most economically vital choke points. In 1340, Majapahit forces cross the sea and subjugate the Malayu kingdom in southern Sumatra.
This campaign secured direct Javanese control over the Strait of Malacca, which is the primary nautical artery for all trade flowing between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea.
By holding that strait, you effectively controlled the toll booth for global commerce.
Precisely. And 3 years later, in 1943, they launch a massive amphibious invasion eastward, targeting the island of Bali.
They systematically dismantle the local defenses, defeat the Balinese king, and establish a deeply integrated Javanese administrative structure on the island. Bali becomes one of their most loyal and culturally aligned vassal states.
This sounds like a string of calculated, successful military maneuvers. But imperial expansion is rarely clean. There is a deeply dark, controversial event in Gajah Mada's career that illustrates the brutal reality of how Majapahit enforced its dominance. The Bubat tragedy.
The Bubat tragedy of 1357 is a stark example of Majapahit's coercive diplomacy. By this time, the Sunda kingdom, located in the western portion of Java, was one of the very few polities on the island that remained independent of Majapahit control.
So a diplomatic marriage was arranged between the young Majapahit king, Hayam Wuruk, and the Sundanese princess Dea Pitaloka.
Right, and a marriage alliance usually implies an agreement between equals.
The Sundanese royal family is traveling to the Majapahit capital, expecting a wedding that will cement a peaceful, horizontal relationship between the two kingdoms.
That was certainly the expectation of the Sundanese king. He traveled with his daughter and a royal retinue to an encampment at Bubat, just north of the Majapahit capital.
But Gajah Mada had other plans.
He did. Gajah Mada saw this marriage not as an alliance, but as an opportunity for total subjugation. He intercepted the Sundanese delegation at Bubat and presented an ultimatum. He demanded that Princess Daya Pitaloka be handed over to the Majapahit king, not as a fully recognized queen, but merely as a concubine.
That is a severe insult. It instantly reduces the entire Sunda kingdom to the status of a conquered vassal.
The Sundanese king and his nobles categorically refused the demand. They were insulted and prepared to leave.
And in response, Gajah Mada deployed the Majapahit military forces surrounding the encampment.
A skirmish broke out, which rapidly devolved into a slaughter. The vastly outnumbered Sundanese royal guard fought to the death. The entire Sundanese royal delegation, including the king, was massacred.
And the princess.
Witnessing the destruction of her family and her kingdom's leadership, Princess Daya Pitaloka committed ritual suicide.
The political fallout from this must have been immense. You can't just murder a neighboring royal family under the guise of a wedding and expect no consequences.
While the massacre technically forced the Sunda kingdom into a nominal state of submission, because they had no leadership left to fight back, it severely damaged the internal cohesion of Java.
It generated a deep, enduring animosity between the Sundanese people of the West and the Javanese of the East.
It really did. It is a cultural scar that persisted for centuries.
So Gajah Mada's aggressive military and diplomatic campaigns successfully drew the expansive borders of the empire. But the true cultural, economic, and administrative peak of Majapahit occurred under the rule of Queen Tribhuwana's son. In 1350, at the age of 16, King Hayam Wuruk ascends to the throne.
Hayam Wuruk's reign, which lasted from 1350 to 1389, is universally recognized by historians as the Golden Age of Majapahit. Under his leadership, working in tandem with Gajah Mada until the Mahapati's death, the empire achieved its absolute territorial maximum.
How large are we talking?
According to the administrative records of the court, Majapahit claimed suzerainty over 98 distinct tributary states. This vast network stretched from Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula in the west, across the Indonesian archipelago, extending as far east as parts of the modern-day Philippines and the coastal regions of New Guinea.
This raises a fundamental question about the mechanics of imperial administration. When we say Majapahit ruled 98 territories, we need to clarify what rule actually means in this context.
Right, because it wasn't like the Roman Empire.
Exactly. If we look at the Roman Empire, their administration was highly direct. They built massive stone walls, constructed paved roads, stationed permanent legions in Gaul and Britannia, and instituted direct Roman law. Majapahit did not do that.
No, they didn't.
If I try to visualize the Majapahit territorial system, it doesn't look like a fenced-in yard with a clear border. It operates more like a corporate franchise model or even a protection racket. The central authority provides the brand, the overarching security, and demands a cut of the profits, but they don't micromanage the daily operations of the distant branches.
That is an instructive analogy. Historians refer to this structure as a mandala polity. A mandala system relies on the gravitational pull of a strong center, with authority radiating outward in concentric circles. Direct control weakens the further you get from the capital.
Let's map out these concentric circles. What does the center look like?
The innermost circle was the Bumi, the core realm comprising the fertile river valleys of eastern and central Java. This area was directly administered by the king, his ministers, and the central bureaucracy.
So they collected direct taxes, managed the irrigation infrastructure, and enforced the legal code there.
Yes, that was the core.
And the next circle out.
The second circle consisted of closely integrated provinces and major vassal states, such as Madura and Bali. These regions were governed by regional lords, who were very often direct relatives or trusted allies of the Majapahit royal family.
They possessed a degree of local autonomy, but were tightly bound to the political decisions of the capital.
Precisely.
But what about the 98 tributary states spread across thousands of miles of ocean? The third circle. If Majapahit didn't build forts or leave permanent military governors on those distant islands, how did they stop a local chief from simply deciding to stop paying taxes? They couldn't just send a text message threatening them.
The relationship with the outermost circle was defined by two primary obligations: Sowiji, which was a sworn oath of political loyalty, and Boga, the payment of an annual tribute.
As long as a distant ruler swore the oath and delivered the required tribute, which usually consisted of valuable spices, rare forest products, or precious metals, Majapahit allowed them to retain complete internal autonomy.
Right. They kept their own customs, their own local laws, and their own domestic leadership.
But the threat of violence has to be there to enforce the tribute.
The enforcement mechanism was naval deterrence. If a distant vassal refused to pay tribute or attempted to ally with a foreign power like China, Majapahit would dispatch a punitive expedition.
A fleet of Zhong warships carrying the Bagankara shock troops.
Exactly. They would arrive, burn the rebellious port, destroy their local shipping capacity, depose the ruler, install a compliant replacement, and then sail back to Java. They didn't need to occupy the territory permanently. They simply needed to demonstrate that resistance was economically and physically ruinous.
We know the specific details of these 98 territories and the intricate workings of Hayam Wuruk's court, largely because of one specific, highly detailed document, the Nagarkritagama.
Yes, the Nagarkritagama, also known as the Desawarnana, was composed in 1365 by a Buddhist court poet and high-ranking cleric named U Prapanka. It is an old Javanese poem, a kakwan, meticulously inscribed onto dried lontar palm leaves.
And it serves as our primary administrative and cultural window into the 14th century empire.
It does. Prapanka details the precise architectural layout of the capital, the complex religious ceremonies, the geographic coordinates of the tributary states, and the philosophical framework of kingship itself.
How did the society actually view King Hayam Wuruk? Was he just a powerful politician or something more?
He was viewed through the theological lens of the Devarasha cult. The king was considered a divine monarch, a living, breathing incarnation of the supreme gods on earth.
His fundamental role was not just political administration, but the maintenance of cosmic balance.
Right. The Nagarkritagama explicitly states that the king must embody the Ashtabrata, the 8 royal virtues.
What are those virtues practically?
They are behavioral alignments with the primary Hindu deities. For example, he must exhibit the ferocity of the fire god Agni when punishing enemies, the sustaining nourishment of the earth goddess Prithvi when managing agriculture, and the vast, encompassing vision of the sky god Surya when governing the realm.
This divine mandate provided the ultimate ideological legitimacy required to command a sprawling, highly diverse archipelagic empire. A divine mandate is powerful, but it doesn't pay the bills. You cannot fund a 30,000-strong professional military, build fleets of teak warships, and construct sprawling brick cities relying solely on poetry and claims of divinity.
No, you can't.
The foundation of this golden age had to be built on an incredibly robust economic engine.
The wealth of Majapahit was generated by a highly sophisticated dual economy. They successfully integrated immense domestic agricultural production with absolute dominance over international maritime trade.
Let's start with the dirt, the agriculture. Because without food security, there is no empire.
The demographic and economic heart of Majapahit was entirely dependent on sawa, or intensive wet rice cultivation. The geography of eastern Java is defined by active volcanoes, specifically in the Brantas and Bengawan Solo River valleys.
And these volcanoes periodically deposit nutrient-rich ash over the landscape, creating some of the most fertile agricultural soil on the planet.
Yes, but you can't just throw rice seeds into volcanic dirt and expect a surplus. Wet rice farming requires intense water management.
It requires monumental engineering.
The Majapahit state organized and oversaw the construction of vast, complex irrigation networks. They built dams to divert river flow, carved terrace paddies into the hillsides, and constructed massive reservoirs to hold water during the dry season.
Who is actually doing the physical labor of digging these canals and building these dams?
The infrastructure was built using corvée labor. Corvée labor is a system where a central government demands unpaid physical labor from its peasantry as a form of taxation.
It is important to distinguish this from chattel slavery. These peasants were not owned by the state.
Exactly. They were required to contribute a specific number of weeks of labor each year to public works projects, after which they returned to their own villages. This highly organized labor force allowed Majapahit to harvest rice multiple times a year, generating an astronomical caloric surplus.
So the inland valleys are producing mountains of surplus rice. How does a caloric surplus translate into the hard currency needed to fund an empire?
The rice was transported down the river networks to the bustling coastal port cities on the northern shore of Java, ports like Tuban, Gresik, and Surabaya. In these maritime hubs, the agricultural economy merged with the global trade network.
Javanese merchants traded their massive reserves of rice to traders arriving from the Maluku Islands in the east. The Maluku Islands are historically famous as the Spice Islands.
They are. At this point in history, highly lucrative spices like cloves, nutmeg, and mace only grew in the unique volcanic microclimates of those specific eastern islands.
And the Maluku Islanders focused entirely on spice cultivation, meaning they relied heavily on imported Javanese rice for their basic sustenance.
So Majapahit essentially monopolized the flow of these spices into the global market.
They trade cheap rice for highly valuable spices. What happens to the spices once they reach the Javanese ports?
They are heavily taxed by the royal port authorities, warehoused, and then sold at a massive markup to foreign merchants. Traders from Ming Dynasty China, from India, and Arab and Persian merchants from the Middle East all congregated in the Javanese ports to purchase these spices.
Majapahit positioned itself as the inescapable, highly profitable toll gate of the entire Indian Ocean and South China Sea trade network.
Yes.
This brings up an interesting logistical problem regarding daily life in the empire. You have an international port city filled with merchants speaking a dozen different languages, dealing in bulk commodities. You have tons of rice, pounds of cloves, and bolts of Chinese silk. How does an average citizen, a local farmer, a dock worker, or a street vendor actually buy a meal or a woven basket in this environment? You can't pay for a bowl of noodles with a solid gold ingot or a sack of nutmeg.
You are highlighting a major structural shift in the Javanese economy during the 14th century. Prior to the rise of Majapahit, local kingdoms relied on an indigenous currency system, using gold and silver coins that were shaped like small seeds or buttons.
But as the Majapahit economy expanded and became vastly more commercialized, those precious metal coins became far too valuable to be used for everyday, small-scale market transactions.
Exactly. If an economy is booming, you need pocket change. You need small denominations to keep the markets fluid.
So to solve this liquidity crisis, Majapahit systematically imported and adopted Chinese copper coins, known as keeping, as their official currency for daily trade.
Yes, these were distinctive round copper coins with a square hole cast into the center.
What is the purpose of the square hole?
It was purely practical. Because each individual copper coin had very little purchasing power, merchants needed to carry hundreds of them for a single transaction. The square hole allowed the coins to be threaded onto strings in standardized batches.
Usually strings of 100 or 1,000 coins, making them easy to count, carry, and trade.
The volume of this foreign currency flowing into Java was staggering. Modern archaeological excavations in East Java routinely unearth hoards containing tens of thousands of these keeping coins from the Majapahit era.
And the widespread use of all this loose copper coinage led to the invention of something we are all incredibly familiar with today.
It did. The need for average citizens to securely store their accumulated copper coins led Javanese artisans to invent the selingan. These were terracotta clay containers featuring a narrow slit on the top, just wide enough to drop a keeping coin into.
And the most common popular shape crafted for these containers was a wild boar or a pig, a literal 14th century piggy bank.
Exactly. The existence of the selingan is a powerful economic indicator. It proves that Majapahit was a highly monetized, prosperous society where not just the elites, but average citizens were actively participating in the cash economy and generating enough surplus income to save money.
And naturally, the central state capitalized on this widespread commercial activity through an exhaustive, highly regulated taxation system. How exactly did they extract wealth from all this activity?
Well, the central bureaucracy, levied taxes on agricultural land yields. They taxed specific artisanal crafts and trades, and they imposed strict entry and exit permit fees for all foreign merchants docking in their ports.
There was even a special higher tax bracket levied specifically against foreigners who chose to take up permanent residence in the Javanese port cities. Managing this massive flow of international wealth requires more than just military strength. You can't just threaten Ming Dynasty China or the regional powers of mainland Southeast Asia if they disagree with your trade policies. Did Majapahit have a diplomatic framework for dealing with states they couldn't simply conquer?
They utilized a formal diplomatic doctrine known as matrica. This phrase translates to maintaining relations as equal friends.
While Majapahit ruthlessly subjugated the smaller island polities into vassalage, the court recognized the geopolitical reality that they could not militarily conquer Ming China, or the powerful Ayutthaya Kingdom in Siam, or the Champa Kingdom in modern-day Vietnam.
So they switched from military coercion to diplomatic engagement. They regularly dispatched highly formalized diplomatic envoys and tribute missions to these mainland powers.
The goal was to secure non-aggression pacts and negotiate highly favorable, standardized trade agreements.
Yes. This pragmatic diplomacy ensured that the primary maritime trade routes remained stable and safe from massive state-sponsored warfare, guaranteeing that the wealth continuously flowed into the Majapahit treasury.
All of this wealth, the taxes from the rice paddies, the massive profits from the spice monopoly, the endless strings of copper coins, ultimately pooled in the capital city of Trallin. It must have been one of the most sophisticated, cosmopolitan urban centers in the world during the 14th century.
The urban planning of Trallin was highly advanced. The city was laid out on a deliberate, expansive grid system. This grid was heavily intersected by a massive network of engineered, navigable canals.
These canals served a dual purpose, right? They supplied fresh water to the dense urban population, and they functioned as the primary transportation arteries.
Exactly, allowing small boats to move bulk goods directly from the surrounding agricultural hinterlands straight into the city's central markets.
What did the city actually look like? When we think of ancient ruins, we usually picture massive gray stone blocks.
The architectural signature of Majapahit is the mastery of red brick. If you look at earlier Central Javanese monuments, like the massive Buddhist stupa of Borobudur built centuries prior, they were constructed using massive blocks of volcanic andesite stone.
But Majapahit builders pivoted to using finely crafted, uniform red bricks. Why the switch to brick?
Brick manufacturing allows for faster, more modular construction, which is necessary for a rapidly expanding imperial capital. Furthermore, they developed a unique structural technique.
Instead of relying on heavy masonry weight, they bonded these bricks tightly together using an organic mortar made from a mixture of vine sap and sticky palm sugar. They essentially glued their temples together with sugar sap. And it worked, because some of these structures are still standing today.
They have survived centuries of earthquakes and tropical weathering. The architecture of Trallin featured striking, highly geometric vertical lines. You can see this prominently in the Padaraksa gates, which are towering roost entryways leading into sacred compounds.
The Candi Bajang Ratu is a perfect surviving example. A slender, imposing red brick gate completely covered in intricate dynamic reliefs. They also pioneered a design known as the Candi Bentar, or the split gate. I've seen images of these. It looks like a single, towering, symmetrical brick structure that has been sliced perfectly down the middle with a sword, and the two halves pulled slightly apart to create a walkway.
That is the exact aesthetic effect. The Ring in Lawang at Trallin is a massive early example of this style. It is important to note that a split gate serves absolutely no defensive military purpose. You cannot close a door across it.
It was an entirely aesthetic, psychological architectural choice designed to create a profound sense of grandeur and transition as a visitor passed from the secular outer world into a royal or sacred inner compound.
The city also featured elaborate public works, such as Candi Tikus, a sunken, multi-tiered ritual bathing complex adorned with terracotta lotus-shaped waterspouts, which clearly demonstrates their advanced hydraulic engineering.
So we have this massive, sprawling, highly populated city. The markets are filled with Chinese merchants, Indian traders, Arab sailors, local Javanese farmers, and royal elites. And with all these different populations colliding, you also have major, distinct belief systems colliding.
Yes, you do.
You have Hinduism, you have Mahayana Buddhism, and you have deeply entrenched local Javanese animism. If I'm looking at this historically, religious diversity often leads to severe sectarian violence. How does the Majapahit state manage this explosive mix of theology without the empire tearing itself apart?
The Majapahit court actively neutralized religious tension by institutionalizing a philosophy of deep syncretism, formally codified as the Siwa Buddha doctrine.
Instead of forcing the population to choose a side in a theological war between Shaivism, the worship of the Hindu god Shiva, and Buddhism, the state theologians promoted the concept that Shiva and the Buddha were simply different manifestations of the exact same ultimate spiritual truth.
Exactly. So they didn't just tolerate each other. They actively rewrote the theology to merge them.
If I can use an analogy, it's like they treated religion like open source software. They told the population, Hinduism and Buddhism are just different user interfaces, but they both run on the exact same underlying base code.
That is a very accurate way to frame it. And the king himself was revered as the ultimate incarnation of both interfaces simultaneously. You can physically see this theological blending in the architecture of the era.
Candi Jawi, a prominent mortuary temple built during this period, perfectly illustrates this, right?
It does. The exterior roof of the temple features a classic bell-shaped Buddhist stupa at its very peak. Yet when you walk into the interior chambers of the exact same building, it houses statues of Hindu deities like Shiva and Durga.
What about the local, everyday farmers who might not understand complex royal theology? The people who still worshipped local nature spirits?
The state was highly pragmatic. They did not attempt to eradicate indigenous Javanese animism or the ancient practices of ancestor worship. Instead, they seamlessly wove those local beliefs into the broader Hindu-Buddhist framework.
They ensured that the agrarian peasantry, who relied on praying to local river spirits and ancestors for successful rice harvests, felt spiritually included and validated by the state religion rather than alienated by it.
This philosophy of profound tolerance wasn't just an unspoken habit, it was actually written down in the literature of the court. It was famously articulated in the Kakawan Sutta Soma, an epic poem written by the revered court poet Umpu Tanchular.
Within this text, Tanchular directly addresses the apparent contradictions between the Hindu and Buddhist faiths. He writes a specific immortal phrase, Bhinneka Tungalika,
which translates roughly to, they are indeed different, but they are of the same kind, as there is no duality in truth. Or, as it is most commonly translated today, though different, we are one.
Though different, we are one. That is a highly sophisticated, inclusive concept of social cohesion for a 14th century empire.
And this philosophical tolerance was backed by a highly structured, predictable legal framework. The Majapahit courts utilized the Kuttaramanawa Dharmashastra.
This was a comprehensive legal code that meticulously blended traditional Hindu jurisprudence imported from India with local adat, which is the customary indigenous law of the Javanese villages. How did that legal code actually function in practice? Was it purely punitive?
It was highly focused on restitution and social balance. The code detailed complex property rights, strict regulations for trade and debt, and a penal system that relied heavily on structured financial fines to resolve disputes and compensate victims.
While capital punishment was certainly utilized for severe crimes against the state or the monarchy, the primary goal of the Kuttaramanawa Dharmashastra was to maintain orderly commerce.
Right. It provided a predictable rule of law that allowed highly diverse populations to conduct business and live together in relative stability.
But history consistently demonstrates that no golden age lasts forever. And it seems that the very system that allowed Majapahit to govern such a massive, decentralized archipelago, relying on the personal loyalty of regional lords and the sheer gravitational pull of brilliant divine leaders, became the exact mechanism of its undoing.
That is the inherent vulnerability of the mandala system.
Yeah.
It requires exceptional, universally respected leadership at the absolute center to maintain the orbit of the outer dependencies. Once that center weakens, the gravitational pull collapses.
In 1364, the brilliant military architect, Mahapati Gajah Mada, dies. And in 1389, the divine monarch, King Hayam Wuruk, passes away. The empire loses its two stabilizing pillars in a relatively short span of time.
And almost immediately, the royal family turns inward and begins fighting itself. A bitter, protracted succession crisis erupts between competing branches of the royal family.
This tension culminates in the Paragreg Civil War, which rages from 1404 to 1406. The eastern and western courts of the Majapahit heartland fight a devastating, highly destructive conflict.
While they're busy destroying their own capital, the outer circles of the mandala simply drift away.
So what happens to the 98 tributary states?
The internal bloodshed of the Paragreg War severely depleted the empire's military resources. They no longer had the naval capacity to launch punitive expeditions to enforce tribute. Furthermore, the Civil War shattered the aura of divine invincibility that kept the distant vassals intimidated.
Without the threat of the Zhong fleets arriving to burn their ports, the regional lords simply stopped paying taxes and declared independence. And while Majapahit is militarily exhausting itself from the inside out, the rest of the global economy is changing rapidly around them. The economic winds are shifting away from the Javanese center.
The global trade dynamics underwent a massive transformation in the 15th century. Chinese imperial trade policy shifted, and newly established maritime routes began bypassing the Majapahit ports entirely.
Concurrently, a powerful new ideological and economic force was spreading rapidly along the maritime trade networks from India and the Middle East: Islam. Why do the regional leaders along the coast begin converting to Islam at this specific moment? Is it purely a theological awakening, or is there an economic incentive?
It was a deeply intertwined mix of economic pragmatism and political strategy. As the central Hindu-Buddhist authority of Majapahit waned, the coastal port cities on the northern shore of Java and vital hubs like the newly formed Sultanate of Malacca on the peninsula saw an opportunity.
Adopting Islam provided these merchants and local rulers with direct, privileged entry into the incredibly wealthy Islamic mercantile networks that dominated the Indian Ocean trade. So by converting, they tap into a massive global free trade zone.
Yes. Additionally, adopting a new, egalitarian religious identity provided them with a perfect ideological justification for formally breaking away from their traditional Hindu-Buddhist Majapahit overlords.
These new Islamic coastal sultanates grew incredibly wealthy from the shifting trade routes, and they rapidly translated that wealth into military power. The power dynamic completely inverts. The ports become stronger than the inland capital.
Exactly. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the Sultanate of Demak emerges as the dominant military power on the island of Java. The Majapahit court, severely weakened by decades of internal strife and entirely cut off from the maritime wealth that once sustained it, is steadily pushed inland.
Finally, around 1527, the military forces of Demak overrun the last remnants of the Majapahit capital. The political entity of the Majapahit Empire officially ceases to exist.
It does.
If we step back and look at this collapse, it raises a philosophical question about history. Does an empire actually die if its cultural core is immediately adopted, preserved, and continued by its successors?
That is the enduring paradox of Majapahit. The political and military structure definitively collapsed, but its cultural DNA survived and heavily influenced everything that developed in the archipelago afterward.
As the Demak forces advanced, many Majapahit elites, including high priests, royal artisans, scholars, and nobility, fled eastward. They crossed the narrow strait and sought refuge on the neighboring island of Bali. They took their entire civilization with them in exile.
They took their sacred Lontar texts, their religious doctrines, and their architectural knowledge. The unique Majapahit blend of Hinduism and Buddhism, the intricate red brick temple structures, the sophisticated shadow puppetry, the complex gamelan music.
It all took deep root in Bali, where it was preserved and where it continues to thrive organically to this very day. But what about the Islamic sultanates that conquered them? Did they just erase the Majapahit aesthetic in Java?
Interestingly, they embraced it. The Islamic sultanates that replaced Majapahit adopted much of its architectural and administrative aesthetic.
The iconic split gates, the Candi Bentar, and the open-air tiered roof pavilions known as the Pendopo became the foundational structural elements of modern Javanese and Balinese architecture.
These uniquely Majapahit designs were seamlessly integrated into the construction of the region's earliest mosques and royal palaces.
We started this journey with Prince Raden Wijaya chewing on a bitter fruit in a dense jungle, pragmatically plotting to steal a kingdom out from under the noses of a massive Mongol army.
We watched that small settlement explode into an empire encompassing 98 territories, driven forward by the ruthless ascetic vow of Gajah Mada.
We saw it funded by a highly complex global spice monopoly, measured out in millions of imported copper coins, and ultimately held together by a profound philosophy that managed to find unity in deep cultural difference.
Majapahit proved, for the first time in recorded history, that the sprawling, highly fragmented islands of Southeast Asia could actually be united. And crucially, it demonstrated that this unity was achieved not merely through brute military force, but through the immense gravitational pull of a shared economic system and a highly tolerant cultural network.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. The Majapahit vision of a unified archipelagic realm, the Nusantara, is so enduringly powerful that the modern nation of Indonesia chose Nusantara as the official name for its brand new capital city currently being constructed in Borneo. And that specific phrase, penned by the 14th century poet Umpu Tantulur, Vineka Tunggal Ika, though different, we are one, is currently the official national motto of the Republic of Indonesia. Think about the weight of that for a moment. A 14th century poem and a prime minister's oath spoken in a brick city still dictate the fundamental identity of nearly 280 million people today. Is an empire ever truly gone if its ghost still draws the maps of the present? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.